All right, welcome back. So in this video, I want to now talk in a little bit more detail about what I believe the subconscious mind actually is, right? So we're not going to go over the curriculum yet, like the official curriculum where I start teaching you theory, right? But I still want to make a couple more intro videos. But in this video, I just want to very briefly talk about what I think the subconscious mind is, right? So now you hear the term subconscious used pretty much all the time or in everyday language, right? So you've heard things like, you heard a person say something like, they were subconsciously aware of something, or they knew something at a subconscious level. You've heard people say things like, your subconscious is trying to speak to you or tell you something, or something like that, right? But what do we actually mean when we say the subconscious mind? What is the subconscious? Well, for most people, if they had to define it, they would probably say that the subconscious is something like, it is an emergent property, right? So first of all, it's an emergent property from the brain and emerges from the interaction of neurons in the brain, right? So that's mainly how they would describe it. And in terms of its function, the subconscious helps to regulate various systems in your body, right? For example, your breathing, your digestive system, things like that, right? It regulates various systems in your body beyond a conscious level. So you're not consciously aware of what it's doing. But the subconscious also does things that do impact your conscious mind, right? So it can regulate memories, feelings, things like that, right? So your subconscious does multiple things. Some of them you're consciously aware of, some you're not, right? But it's mostly an automated sort of function of the brain that emerges from the interaction of neurons, right? So that's how most people would probably describe the subconscious, right? So I don't really feel it necessary to go into kind of how I came to all this information in these videos. Although I did put like a introduction to it in the book, and the book's also on the website. So if you're curious about that, you can look that up. But suffice it to say, when I first started studying the subconscious mind, right, which actually, I almost had two beginnings, right, to how I started studying and stuff. One time when I was much younger, in my early 20s, and another time was much later, when I was studying the nature of emotions, right? So I started studying that, and, I'm trying to understand basically what I was studying more and more and more and more, and eventually, I started to observe certain things in my own mind, right, that just didn't make sense to me, right? So in other words, at that, I pretty much have always been sort of a theory guy, right? So I'm trying to create theory on these things I'm observing in my own mind, and I'm just not able to fully make sense of it, right? And this is not just theory for the fun of it, right? Or in terms of like something I can't verify, right? So I'm creating theory and then doing things, right? And seeing how my own mind responds and things like that. So in other words, I'm trying to come up with a theoretical predictive model for what I'm experiencing, right? And I just couldn't do it, right? There were certain things that just didn't make sense to me. And eventually I came to the realization, right, that the reason I could not come up with a predictive model understanding what I'm experiencing and what I'm observing in my own mind, I eventually realized that the problem was because I kept thinking that the mind, or the subconscious, I didn't know it was the subconscious at the time, I kept thinking the subconscious was physical, right? So in other words, I thought also to some degree that it was an emergent property from the interaction of neurons in the brain, right? And what I eventually learned was no, right? That is not true, right? And that's what I want to kind of go over in this video. So the subconscious, as I've come to understand it and what I've come to learn about it, the subconscious is not physical. It is actually metaphysical, right? Some people might say it is spiritual, but ultimately it exists in some people call it the spirit realm or the unseen realm or the metaphysical realm. You could use different terms for it, but it's not physical, right? And so that's a very interesting thing, right? It's very important, right? That's a huge sort of property for the subconscious to have, right? When it comes to trying to understand how it works. And so once I started to understand that, basically when I postulated that, I'm like, I think the subconscious is metaphysical, right? Then it kind of made perfect sense. Like, of course, I think the conscious mind is also metaphysical. Makes sense the subconscious mind would be metaphysical. Seemed kind of obvious, right, once I came up with the idea. But at the time, right, it wasn't obvious to me, although it should have been. But yeah, once I came up with the idea that the subconscious was metaphysical, then it was way easier to create theories. So many things just made sense, right? All these sort of chips, well, I don't really like using this term, but all these chips just sort of fell into place, right? Things that I couldn't understand, didn't make sense, wasn't sure about, it just came much more sort of clear to me, right? And I certainly didn't understand everything. This was like in almost, I'd probably say this was in probably the first year of me studying all this stuff, right? Where I came to that conclusion, right? But yeah, so there was still way more for me to learn. But the real sort of turning point, right, in my understanding of the subconscious is when I realized that, right, that the subconscious was not physical, right? Now, what actually ends up, the way it actually works, this is kind of how I see things, right? Your self, you might say, right, is made up, you could basically break it up into three parts, right? There's the conscious mind, there's the subconscious mind, and then there's your physical body, right? Now, what most people recognize or what they're observing when they study the subconscious or think about it is they're actually observing the interaction between your physical body and your subconscious. And that's a big topic, right? We actually cover that in book 1. We're actually going to cover that in chapters 4, 5, and 6, right? The interaction between subconscious and the body. So that's a very important topic. But ultimately, the subconscious isn't the body. It just interacts with the body, right? But it's its own entity. It is a component of who you are, right? And it has its own set of rules and its own properties and its own everything, right? Which has nothing to do with the body. And so that's very interesting, right? That's what I learned. And ultimately what I learned is that I learned two things. So I'll kind of say that and then I'll end the video. But there's two very interesting things I learned about the subconscious, or that I've come to believe about the subconscious. So the first thing is that the subconscious is, well, no, let me say, I was going to say the second thing. No, let me just say it this way. So the first thing I learned about the subconscious is that the subconscious has a huge, right, amount of rules, right? And that's basically what the whole curriculum, what I'm going to teach you guys about in this channel, right? I'm going to teach you guys about those rules. But I learned that the subconscious has its own set of rules, which they work in a very similar way to physics, right? So when you learn, if anybody's taken physics, now I'm talking about high school physics, so basically Newton's laws and things like that, classical mechanics, you know that basically all of physics basically starts with three main axioms. Usually you learn some basic equations of motion, usually it's called kinematics, you know, of a single function. And then you learn Newton's three laws of motion. I think, if I had to say it, I think first one is about uniform motion. Any object in motion will stay in motion at constant velocity, or if it's at rest, it'll stay at rest. So basically something like that, unless acted on by another force. Second law of motion is basically acceleration is proportional to the force exerted on the object, or force experienced by the object, and acceleration, or force equals mass times acceleration. Third law of motion is basically something to the effect of, you've probably heard it stated this way, which this way is accurate enough, but it's for every action there's opposite but equal reaction, right? So that's basically Newton's three laws, and then there's gravity, right? Now, if you studied physics, you know that those three laws form the basis of all of classical mechanics, everything else you learn about, right? So you learn about energy, the energy of a system, right? And you learn about different systems and things like that. And, I was going to say, you learn about different energy systems, right? Then you learn about this is kind of the order I learned it in, but you learn about vibrations, then you learn about like sound and gases and thermodynamics, and then, you know, you might learn about statics in that process as well. But you might learn about fluids, but then you also learn about thermodynamics, and then electrical energy, light optics, and things like that, right? And so these, and electromagnetism, and these are all topics of physics. But all of these topics are just applications, they're outgrowths of Newton's three laws of motion, right? And I say all that to say that that's really how the subconscious works as well, right? So Newton's three laws are basically axioms, right? So they're just axioms that basically, they're just given to you, right? They're not necessarily proven, they're just presented as true based on what you observe, right? So if you assume those things to be true, well, what else is true? And basically that's where you get all the physics. So that's kind of how my theory is set up, right? So I give you very basic axioms about the subconscious in the beginning of the book, right? Beginning of the curriculum. But what I have learned is that there is a huge, right, amount of information and consequences from certain basic axioms of the subconscious. Particularly, that is one of those axioms is that it's metaphysical. And so there is a lot to learn, right, about the subconscious, which is why it's 2 books, right? But, and this ties into the second thing I want to say. When you learn all those rules about the subconscious and how it works and why it does what it does and how to control it, right? Because it's very tricky to control it. But once you learn its rules, you can now control it and get it to do the things you want. I learned that the subconscious is so powerful, right? It is very, very powerful. And what it can do is really a reflection of a gift we're given by God, right? So that's what I believe, right? The subconscious is basically a gift from God, and it's basically a tool that comes from God, and we're able to use that tool, we're able to use that tool to create our own reality, right? So it's that powerful, right? It's so powerful, it helps us to create our own reality, right? But the thing about it, though, is that you have to know how to use it, right? So I like to think of the subconscious as I like to think of it as being something that you buy from the store, like a dresser or something, or you can say like a bike, something for kids. And, when you get these things, a lot of times they'll come with an instruction manual, right? Because they're very complicated to sort of build up from scratch, just on your own, right? Not everything needs that, but some things are complicated enough where it's like, okay, you need an instruction manual. That's how I like to think of the subconscious, right? So the subconscious is very powerful, right? But in a sense, it requires an instruction manual, right? And if you don't have that instruction manual, it's going to be hard to use it, right, to its full potential. And so that's why I wanted to make these videos, right? I feel like most people don't use their subconscious anywhere near, right, its full potential because they don't know how to use it, right? And so they use it in a very, I want to say haphazard way, right? They use it just use it not being consciously aware of what it's capable of, right? So they use it at a very sort of flat or initial level, right? That doesn't do as much as it could, right? It still does stuff, but not as much as it could. And so this curriculum and what I'm teaching you guys and what this channel is going to be about is going to be that instruction manual for your subconscious. And once you learn how to use your subconscious and you learn its rules and what it does and things like that and why it does what it does, then there's a whole host of things that you can now do and you'll be able to sort of capitalize on. And I think these things will change your life for the better, right? So basically that's what I wanted to sort of get across in this video, right? That, that the subconscious has a whole bunch of rules and it'll change your life for the better once you learn them. And because by learning them, you'll learn how to control your subconscious. So what can you do once you actually learn how to control your subconscious? What changes? Well, I want to talk about that in the next couple videos. So it's 4 main things you'll be able to learn how to do. And I want to kind of give each thing, right, its own video, just to talk about it more in depth, right? And not to make one video too long. But ultimately, you'll be able to do 4 main things. Now, and that's kind of how the book is broken up as well. But we're going to talk about those 4 main things throughout the book. But there's a 5th thing that is very important that we're going to talk about pretty much toward the end of the curriculum about the metaphysical realm. And that does involve all 4 of the things that I'm going to teach you about. But that's just going to help you to understand reality much more. So I'm going to talk about that in its own video as well. So that's it for this video. That's basically what the subconscious is in a nutshell. And in the next couple videos, we're going to talk about what you can actually do once you learn to control your subconscious. So that's it for now, though. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video.